Are we on? Is anyone else on that we see?
I
Urja.
don't. There's
I remember Urja.
Urja.
Yes, she is.
I'm coming.
Oh,
There.
yeah.
I'm here.
Okay. Well, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, then.
How has it been? Look, let's say it's almost as if we are looking from the other side of the mirror, you and I, to a large extent, into the world. So even if you're watching a TV series, it's like the mirror is looking at the TV series, so there's a reflection back on it. But what I'm saying is that there's somehow a space that occupies itself in you where you are close to the observer, what they call the observer, or Krishnamurti called the observer, or they call the energy or the soul of the story, or somehow unknown to the literal mind or the literal being. There's always been somehow an intuitive awareness that besides the literal self, there is also a deeper sense that passes through time, that is, grandchildren may experience it and meet you. And so somehow there's always been an intuitive sense of an energy carrying on, and then the attempts to explain it.
Yeah.
Okay. Then become ways of surviving and navigating a world that may be a very, very challenging world without the conceptualization of itself. But in the perception of itself, the aloneness is not a sentence of isolation. The aloneness is a perception of a fact that's happening and that has affected the life in unknown ways and in known ways. But when it's perceived, it is no longer captured by the psyche or explanation or anything like that. You see, the navigation of a life is an artwork in itself. And at the same time that it's navigating its survival, literally, it is also aware, has many awarenesses of its being that is searching for something else, looking for something else, exploring something else, at the same time that it's carrying on. And yet the person that is living in these levels is only explores that in friendship of sorts, that releases it. And when it's released in friendship, the person becomes aware of that dimension themselves, in articulating it, in sharing it. When you've experienced something of a kind of shared life being the life itself, what's the philosophy again, Urja? A darshan yoga, let's call it darshan yoga. I was just reading that little booklet that we had years ago about being with something deeply enough where it's revelatory. And then the questions then came up, is the guru, they say, disciplement, love of learning, which created an intensity in another, which created a dialogue. And as long as that trust was there, that dialogue was there. And I say, why? Because that dialogue was based on a kind of trust, a creative trust. And it resembles relationship. It resembles, no matter what level of people, whatever they are in the world, they still may fall for each other and have a marriage. And yeah, okay. That somehow there is still a dialogue independent of the social structure. So how are you doing, Raja?
I'm I'm doing okay, Danny. Amazingly, it's it's just
Amazing.
amazing. I mean, we are we have so much snow.
Yeah, we also have are in a process of so much snow now also. Yeah. But then there was a series called Derek. It's on Netflix,
Oh yeah.
and it's about these disturbed guys who take care of old people in this home or something. But it's pretty brilliant at times, and goofy. So there's one called Derek, and then there was another one that was just mother and daughter. I think it was Chinese. It was also on Netflix, and it's a mother and daughter who don't speak to each other and avoid each other and struggle, and then they're in this and they lose each other and find it, and they go through. So even though it had a Chinese element to it, meaning and the kind of emotions were different, we expressed. That they found the dialogue in Lost, but it was a very interesting film. Uh, what the Fall? It was called The Fall. The, the waterfall, yeah, like The Fall. It was called, yeah.
On
I think it was on Netflix or something. But if you could stay with it, I mean, it's not our sort. Usually, an American style movie, it didn't have the same. Um, but it has a kind of feelings where they couldn't meet, they did meet, and they were meeting and dying or something.
hmm.
So, what do you make of this journey so far, Jack? That we've in our sharing, we're kind of illuminating the norm without, hopefully, without hyperinflation, but seeing the dimensions that you would only be able to see in retrospect. Retrospect meaning a state of mind. To our mind's eye, it's in time. That needs, before you can see what happened today, you needed to pass 20 years or something, or there to be a reaction somewhere else, and you have a holy shit moment where you see the moment as it was perceived by others. But you also see the move in the story, how each psyche protects itself from an experience. And the experience is that to see one's life as survival in that mode is to see a creep. If to see it blatantly, it is to see it almost on the battlefield. Survival, where when if you would look at survival from sitting on a rock looking at the battlefield, you would see a very creepy situation in front of you. And from the perspective of that, it is a creepy situation because it is a creepy situation, not because it's not a creepy situation. From the perspective of sitting on the rock and looking at the human condition, the survival sentiment taking over the complete story or making a move is creepy.
What's happening with Ukraine is very creepy.
It seems to me that what's happening in Ukraine is an aspect of what is happening almost everywhere and everything. Where you don't know if you're being bullshitted all the time with, okay. So then for us, what would be the movie has become more of our reality, and that life has some grace to it that somehow is cared for. Now, whether you care for it by yoga, whether you care for it by Jesus, whether you care for it by boyfriend, girlfriend, that somehow you're nurturing a thread that runs through the life. And in the beginning phases, it's naively written into the story. But then there is also a phase where we enter into the literal story no longer as organized into it, but seeing it from a different place. And the lives that we've created have become our reality, not in a literal sense, but in the creative sense. So if there's an attempt to literalize our life as this or that, or this, it's by numbers, as is increasingly seemingly to happen, where you no longer exist, but the picture of you, and then the picture of your picture, and the picture of your picture, and the picture of the picture becomes you. Then you understand, even if you call any of these places up, you have to wait 2 days on the phone or something. There's a literal you calling up. Okay. So let's say you experience that more and more in your own way. Yeah. Where intimacy seems to be turned into a product for sale or something. But intimacy on a deeper scale is somewhat alone with yourself. And it's not only loneliness as a dialogue, but meeting for the first time in a force that has driven the story all along, where somehow you meet yourself, not as the literal self, but somehow you sought to see deeper dimensions in your existence that you have been somehow in the story that you've been aware of, and yet you realize this happened. And that somehow you join the energy in your life where the forces that are happening are not strangers to you now. And it's not so much, it doesn't seem to be, extended life seems to come out of, if there's something creatively that invites you to another dimension in the story, then you have creative time. And creative time can be as different as a glance at the clock, or snow coming down, or seeing the seasons. So you're seeing that time that you have what we call normally wishful thinking, that somehow this period that you're in is wishful. And you're in a place where that's normal with everyone who's in the rooms and down the hall from you. They're all in a similar space where there's a dialogue happening in their bodies, in the circumstance, where the social structure recognizes that. So you see that somehow you're in a situation where there's a looking out for you to be, where somehow you're allowed to be, where somehow the literal fears have been put into an abeyance of sorts, of how to manage, where will I go, the Social Security, this, where one is preoccupied with that construct of the balancing act, which is not to say bad, it's brilliant. The balancing act is brilliant. The body is also making it, the brain is making it. And even in figuring out how much and what to do with this and how much is coming in and what is brilliant, if it's brilliant, if it's released somewhat from the fear domination. And you see that the balancing act is actually you buying time, creative time, literal time if necessary, but more creative time. And that is for the situation to change somewhat, for this to happen, that to happen. But you see, one is creatively utilizing time that releases the story and releases us from decision making. where we're kind of faked out into literally making a decision about a world that's up in the air. And to literalize which way to go and that way to go and whatever, when in fact your relationship is to the human. And that means something that the people will discover one day by being inhuman. There will be a moment where one perceives the moves. So let's say when one attempted to be with the human in their life, and without spelling it out so literally, but somehow the ability to be touched, the ability then to share through time and space, in absence and in presence, in memory or whatever, to share a tear, a feeling, a memory. And it's accidental of sort, not as a possessive, but there needs to be a true element lining up for you to have the genuineness of the experience. And I say from my perspective, when we agree to buy a year or two or to shape it this way, and I'm discussing that with folks who seem to be on the verge of maybe passing away as in the story or in the neighborhood for them, not as a fear basis. The fear is the treatment, not so much passing away or living or whatever. Doesn't have such a fear. The fear is the pain and the treatment that comes automatically in the social fabric. But for us, it comes from an agreement that we're allowing this to happen then. We'll try it. We'll give it a shot. We're into it. So somehow, where it is not so driven by its karma, but you see that this period of life has more of a dharmic element to it. That it's the grace from your perspective, and that is one of the, how do they say in French, raison d'être? Is that how they say it?
Raison d'être.
Reason for being or reason for expression. And that includes moments that will come into you where there's real soul searching. And soul searching means what? The ego will call itself. I don't want to make the ego a criminal. It is designed to survive. But you also see that it has limited information because it's only around survival. It's avoiding the other dimensions of its being. So it organizes it. If it has a religious feeling, it organizes it into a religion. So it organizes it into knowing, while at the same time it's suppressing all these other dimensions. So from the creative perspective, you see when the life is suppressed, and then that suppressed life becomes bad or evil or whatever, when you also saw it was in fact inherently not so much a need, but there is a dialogue going on with a pure love affair in the world. There, it needs to be in love. It needs to have that feeling in some way, but it's criminal and it's this and that. One has to be a sneak in an organized life over nothing. But as it is suppressed and repressed, but when one perceives that in fact, one comes into the story from that place creatively, then you see then what's needed for you in the story is a kind of genuineness. And that you understand that as the feeling shifts, it takes you into different dimensions of the circumstance that you're in. But even in the certain circumstance that you're in, as you perceive it deeply, you see that there's a creative process going down where your presence is inviting. But usually the people will miss you in absence. In the missing, they may meet you. And so that's what this film was a bit about, even though it had its Chinese elements to it. The understanding was that when they missed each other, they met each other in some way. And it wasn't only a psychological meaning where you saw the world was kind of dominated by a psychological state and explained by the psyche. But they kind of met as a person, it seemed. That sometimes happens, and that the story somehow was released from its literalness to its poetry, as it is thought of. What do you say? Is that too schmaltzy for you?
No, not at all.
Well, then you'll have pain management, I imagine.
Yes, that's for sure. God. And there are pain that seems, oh my God, that's going to be tough. And it goes away. And it's really weird.
It is weird to meet your body as if it's a baby.
Yeah.
And the baby demands right now, right? Not like, you got to get up right now to feed the baby or something like that, no matter what you're doing. And the body is acting that way for you now as an older, right? Right now. You say, no, later. You say, no. So then what can you do? Since you are, doing means what? There's pain management, but not so much pain go away. The management of it kind of, I thought you had buns on it. I thought Brenda had a new haircut. That's Brenda. Brenda, have you seen her? No.
Yes,
Okay.
earmuff.
Huh? She
He was
has
having
earphones on.
earphone.
Yeah. So what do you say now that we've kind of created this format between us where there is a perceptive sense or an immersive that we share? And the immersive is somehow, whatever the differences in our circumstance, we are sharing a somehow process of living and dying, being intimately in the life. As a normal life, but perceptively as if we would also be in the theater or creative people, where you see when you assume a character in the theater, you're also assuming the living and dying process of the character. And in that, in assuming that character, there's something that's happened to you in your own relationship to a similar character in your life, where the deeper you go in the ability to see deeply what is happening, the human situation that you're sharing with the person, you've released your hold on your own. And in that release, you see your parents were not only your parents, but they were people, and they were beyond people, unknown. And so it releases the story to flux, not a literal history. And in the perception, it releases your life to more of a flux than a literalness. You see then that there is more of a poetry in your history than there is a karma. You see that it was not only repetition literally of the pain, but you see there was also a romantic moment in it, this and that. You also see a life.
Yeah.
So you also understand that it was not just hurt people and this people and that. You see, it was a life. And they were people. And yet it was brilliant. And it had every element in it hidden in plain sight. So that one has to, in a Freudian way, figure out what happened. And I say, take a picture of these two characters and you can see what happened. You came out of these two characters and lived with them for a long time. You don't need, let me figure out, Lord, what happened. And I said, look at these two characters, man, that's all. I said, that's not the whole story, but there's a real laugh in it. There's a holy shit moment in it. And it somehow releases the story from this literalness. And you see that you've had somehow a chance to live.
Yes.
That somehow in the perception, it's not, doesn't release the story like kicking it out or getting rid of it. It releases the story from one's possessiveness of survival, where you had to make creeps of your parents in order for you to be the, okay. But at the same time, when you see it, the story is released from the possessive, and you see somehow a peopleness, a personhood. It releases the story from the possessive, and its psychological control in the perception. And the perception doesn't literally forgives. It comes from the creative perspective of releases the story from its own ownership. And it sees somehow that much of its life has been mystical or spiritual, not literal. It visits all these dimensions and all these books and all these religions and all these structures. It's in it, but it's not of it. It comes now from its own discovery. And so then when it looks to the left or the right or backwards or forwards, it also sees a whole population of beings that are coexisting around discovery, around creativity. And that they kind of meet an accident, and it's not so much accident as without motive, without the survival motive dominating the story, but the exploratory desire being the inherent need or desire. So that they represent to each other an exploration of what's hidden in plain sight. But that somehow one needs to be in a human enough state to be able to see that dimension. And you can see, then I say, okay, is there like, I don't know, these questions then that come to the story. You have a relationship to a perspective throughout your life. And you see then, someone sent me a message. It said, I don't want to curse on your channel, but it said, it showed a person's back. It said, the three elements of life. And that was, you're born, you screw up for a long time, and then you die. And those were the three elements of life to look forward to. What do you say, Derek?
Sounds pretty close.
Sounds close to what's happening?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a very slow, snowy day. Imagine the same for you. Take a look at this dopey show, Derek, if you like.
Yeah.
It's that same, I forget his name, the comedian who did Another Dying, where his wife passed away.
Oh.
Ricky Gervais.
Ricky Gervais. So he resisted, and I think in that show, in the Dying show, where his wife passed away, he had her talking you go online every night and still review the show and get advice from her, but also he resisted any kind of situation with anyone else like that or created. So it was pretty interesting. Some of the places you visit and you see mirror reflections. So some of the shows are like walking past the mirror to some degree.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden something turns your way and you look and you see something else happening.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, the doer is kind of relaxed in the seeing. The seeing to me now is inherently part of the everyday, not something that one needs to go into meditation literally for, but one is in fact in a state of meditation already, where it didn't mean any artificial state of meditation or anything like that, but a normal state. What you were doing was creating a normal state in yourself that was inherently around the energy, the relationship to the energy. And so it did have similarities to coming from a creative space, literally, as if you were hearing music a lot, as if you were thinking of this or that or whatever, producing, or, but you also see the creative aspect of that is not neurotic. In the literal sense, it becomes neurotic. It becomes captured in the survival sense. But somehow I feel in the perception of a creative life, one is in fact living a creative life that they took as normal. The difference is in the perception of it, it's you doing it somehow. And then you are measuring your element of survival versus creativity. And it's very much like taking a temperature. You understand that somehow you're living somewhat in a civilized environment still. And that civilized environment is allowing you, whatever the form that you're in, a civilized expression, what it seems like the weirdest world out there according to news and this and what's going on and that. But at the same time, it's civilized. And I feel civilized doesn't mean squashing it or suppressing it. In fact, it's the opposite of that. Is that there's room for different expressions within the form as long as they're coming from a true place. Within the person, no trip. So what does it mean? It means that we share a common feeling. Nothing is fixed for us, but it is your expression. Where we don't have such a literal relationship with the government or the structure or this and that, we have a relationship to what we perceive or our feelings about what's right. And so when we perceive in America, we perceive a kind of what's right. If we find out it becomes another creep in the world, there's a bad feeling, you understand, because you have a naive sense that there's an American in America. There's an America, the literal trip of make a buck or whatever, but there's America that comes from our innocence, our schmuckiness, that's kind of inherently there, where you'll help someone out or you'll look out for this or you'll do, so that somehow, so when you run into the other America where it's bullshit and there's a real, you're in this weird space because your relationship is with the naiveness of it or the grace of it, because you see that runs through the story. And so I feel as long as there is a creative invitation, I do feel it affects the health and the expression. That one, if you're into it and the body then is into it, but if not, I think that it will surrender. You let the knees go, please let me go. And the knees may say, or the feet may say, please let me go already. What do you think? And I may not be able to say, okay, I have to let you go. You served me well. Thank you very much. Okay. So is it too dopey or is it?
No.
Okay, let's have a more intellectual conversation with our processes. And I say, the conversation is happening independent of our perspective on it. When there is, in fact, and it takes a sensibility to be able to see the conversation in the body that's been happening all along is somewhat hidden from the self, who kind of is hiding from the experience to some degree in order to continue. So the self is based on continuing no matter what. But as it explores its own being, survival isn't the main ingredient any longer. It finds a magic in itself. Remember that picture? We were exploring something this morning, and the person was going through something in their body, and I said, well, if you can get this picture, you'll see exactly what's happening.
Oh, that's a great.
Yeah, no, this is the great, it shows every organ in the body, and then around the side, that was in the New York Times last year.
Oh,
But if you want to check up on something, that gives you a kind of complete
yeah.
picture of
Yeah.
a happening there. Or How We Die is a very good book for certain pains and situations, not in terms because the guy was such a nice fellow and he was so knowledgeable physically that he knew symptomatics and so on like that, you know.
Being mortal is still on the list. On the
Excuse me, the immortal?
yeah, no, being mortal. You know,
Oh,
you mentioned that book a lot, and it's still on the bestseller list in paper book.
I got this book, the Book of Jacob, that I
Oh, you
mentioned.
did?
Yeah, I got that book, the Book of Jacob. They held it for me yesterday, and so we'll see if now reading is a question, though. You know, really getting down and
It sounds so complex, like Pynchon.
yeah. Well, Pynchon I've always loved. Have you ever read any of Pynchon's, Derek?
I read V.
Oh, V is a strange and wonderful book. We were in very weird situations when we read V, and it was like Catch-22.
Yeah.
But it was the sheer weirdness of life was kind of just revealed by this guy, you know, and us who are in weird situations in life saw the absolute hipness of what he was writing and what was happening. And this book somehow is a kind of book around being there around when the Messiah was there and hanging out. And it looks like it's based on that, the false Messiah, they call it, the Sabbatai Svi. But then she has another book that's called Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Sticks landing after landing, a philosophical fairy tale about life and death that's been trying to spill its secrets. Secrets that if you have kept your ear to the ground, you knew in your bones all along. New York Times Review. Pretty good. So this one, they've also given her a brilliant revelation because she shows what happens then. It's as if she's hanging out with the Messiah as he's going through all these things and what's going on in Europe at the time. And I think it's based on some of the literal events where they forced then the Messiah to become Christian, then they formed him to become Islamic, but But that basically he just incorporated all of those three into one story. And so I've read that book for a long time now. It took place in Salonika. It ended up, and so there's a long history of people who've come from that time period, who came from a messianic era, who grew up in that and came from that. And so then in reading this book here by her, who's brilliant, where she makes her own novel out of it, let's see where it goes. But what the story was, that there were common people hanging out, disenfranchised people, situations who experienced this or that, who created miracles within their friendship and circumstance that were normal, that the miraculous life was the normal life for them. And that they found that they could make plants grow certain ways or affect their bodies different ways or weird ways. That once they all shared a circumstance, that they shared a way of living based on a kind of friendship and trust or whatever. It's not to say, because this also becomes literalized as cults and organized into religious structures of how to live, when in fact much of it is intuitive, not literal. And so, meaning what? If you have your daughter comes home, even if you haven't seen someone for 10 years, there's immediately a connection. What is that? Try to explain it.
Mhm.
But immediately it cuts through time and space, whatever you have to do and not have to do with, but it's immediately there. And it's been a parallel life all along, but then it has immediacy when it comes into the circumstance. And yet, if a stranger comes and knocks on the door, you can say, no, I'm busy or this or that. But somehow you have to be there for the mystery. And it's normal. So you see that there are events in so-called out there, that it's not only a snow about to happen or something like that, but you also see that there's an events about to happen around you in different ways, personally, structurally, on a larger picture for humanity or your community. Or so you start to discover, if there's a shootout, as happened last year in the supermarket there, you discover your community from another place. And all of a sudden you remember someone that you may have forgotten or something like that, and then see their picture in the paper. And so you also see how many elements exist, how many parallel situations and coexist for you. And as you become aware of them, they become creative expressions. Just as if you were painting or making a film or whatever, they somehow release you from the literalness of your story. Where you then meet the person as a friend, who then assumes the identities, but that cannot be faked. In other words, there are experiences hidden in the literalness of the story. And especially in our story, there's a movie hidden in the relationship. And usually it can only be experienced in the passing, because there's a kind of quality of being that experiences it in the passing that can't experience it when it's literally there in front of it. It's still literally magnetized to it. So it can't give it a snow. It gives it a literal story. Okay, do you understand? So it's in the loss that you see another dimension that we've called soul, but unknown to us, that we intuit, that we feel, but somehow can only be accessed when you come from a genuine place. So then you see the relationship to the other is not only the literal relationship, you see there's an evocative relationship, that there's a whole dimension of experiences hidden in plain sight, freed from the literalness of the story, I think you get a peep of life not being so dominated by birth and death, but those are aspects of the experience, not the dominating forces of the experience. It's almost as if consciously one comes into the story at any time that the consciousness comes. One consciously enters the story, no longer karmically driven. But then you see a born again experience is that something new starts from that perspective. It is not a carrying through of the history. But when it comes from a deeper perspective, it enters more into the mysteries of life. And from the mysteries of life, you see your relationship to the whole is not driven by unconscious forces, but is related to conscious force. Your relationship to the whole is the intelligence of your experience, your life. And so I feel that as you have that, you see the other dimension of why you're present in the story. And why at times your presence will be contradictory to the literalness that surrounds us. But also something it's okay. We've gone through a very interesting period of time here while we've gone through our own personal challenges. We've gone through the Holy Ghost as a background, and everyone predicting what it is and what it isn't and what to do and what not to do and how to avoid it, how not to avoid it, whether it existed or didn't exist or whatever, but it was a ghost that ran through the story. And it's a ghost that illuminated the story, divided the story, created the story, and faked you out into taking sides and literalizing the situation. And there's always forces that are attempting to literalize the story. But at the same time, you see the life in flux. And you see your relationship is to the human. And I say, why? Because if you've had contact with the mystery at all, then you re-enter the story as a person. It's no longer driven by its personhood in the same way. So when you've had a relief from the story and you re-entered it creatively, it's also somewhat coming from a different place. Because it has awakened a dimension of its life that is as important as survival, and that's the creative dimension. Without the creative dimension, the survival dimension starts to peter out very quickly as to not making sense any longer. So when sense, the literal sense of survival is the common denominator, when it doesn't make sense, the logic of something any longer, it starts to grow. From the creative dimension, the very existence that it's in and situation is part of a creative expression. So let's say that let's say Jai will become more like Mel Brooks. We'll see what happens. Has anyone else been on today? It's been, discussing life in the immersive of living and dying as a fact of life. That's as much as normal as breathing and seeing. That the fact seeing that much of your life then also takes on a dimension where what was literally normal has a creative dimension to it. And you see the threads that run through the story. And so I feel in that time shifts. So when in fact there's somehow of an immersive around living and dying in the everyday perceptively, without it being captured as a horror movie or something like that. Although there may be moments when it is, just as if you take a trip on something, you may have a horror moment. And that may simply seeing what is, okay? But let's say you're not examining so much the literalness of living and dying as examining a process that has been hidden all along in your life, that you've tried to discover or find out, or at the same time that it's basically being avoided. And the avoidance of its prior existence is natural to its experience. It's around survival. But the next dimension that happens is that it's coming from a different place than survival. Survival was, in fact, caring for the child so that it was free to live. But free to live meant free to live. Free to live, I feel, is what comes out of the perception. And in the free to live, there is a connection to life that is a bit different than the survival of the self being the immediate force. You see, a shared life comes out of that by its nature. And that the sharedness that comes out of the naturalness has its own integrity. It's not a job, it's not a business, it's not a this. It may become those expressions, but it is not that. It is a feeling that comes from a real place in the person that's genuine and touches another. And in that being touched, even if the people are very different, they share that feeling and they're able to explore a dimension that was hidden from each other in plain sight. The discovery of the literal spirituality that exists in the life with the everyday, that discovery transforms the story to some degree in your relationship to it. You see that you're caring for something. And that is no longer in the literal world where things are spelled out in language and structure and so on. It is not a structural life. It's somehow, as long as you're into it, it exists. But this time the into it now is coming from a different place, not fear-driven around survival, not owned by survival or by the identity. The story has no ownership. I feel from that perspective, you're even keeping diaries of events and circumstance and shared situations. Becomes an access to something for you, where you see that you are participating in the life that you're living perceptively. And that in participating in it, you kind of shift time from survival time to creative time. Meaning not the literal time of survival has it's fear driven. In creative time, fear is not the dominant force of continuity. Fear is an indicator, like other features that you would have, of looking at it a bit further. Looking at it, not literalizing the looking at it, but in fact, part of your being is looking at it. And it sees the human thread that runs through the literal story. And you see that the human thread that runs through the story is unknown to the person. And that somehow in your experience, you are representing that thing which is kind of hidden to the person. And that has attraction and fear relationship to it. Because hidden in the attraction is a conversation that will interrupt the status quo. So that's somewhat of the question that you asked last week there, Derek, about when you see something that may be uncool happening in the situation you're in, your presence interrupts what may have been normal, but the primary presence is that you're creating reflection in the people, not so much the doer.
Hmm.
Your presence created a reflection where the normalcy, if it's not human, the normalcy is no longer normal by your presence. Now, whether it literalizes, I feel that would speak to you in a way that you, where the person's life and your own life converge. That would mean like you would save someone or something like that and take the hit in order to save them, which you would normally do for our kids or something like that. You would cover them if someone was hurting and you take the hit or whatever. So somehow it's not only instinctive, but in the instinctive, there's a creative dimension happening, even a spiritual dimension happening. You're caring for a future experience in the person by surrendering some dimension of your own. And you see it. You see the creative processes that are happening in the life. But now they're no longer rules. And now they're no longer, you're forced to it. You see the creative processes are creative processes. They're not creative processes if you have a gun to your head. Okay. Anything else? Can you see anyone else on there, Derek?
I don't see anybody. I don't have YouTube up. Let me take a look.
Okay. Because I don't know if they, is that okay, Urja? You just,
Perhaps. Thank you. Yes.
let's see if you find that Chinese movie there on Netflix of the mother and the daughter meeting.
What's the name of the movie?
What was it again there? The Fall.
The Fall. The Waterfall.
No, the falls.
The Falls.
FALLS.
Yeah, so the Fall.
Okay. Okay.
The Falls. Wonder why it's
Thank-
called. I'll have to see it again and again. It's very dry and slow, but
She has the sound of the waterfalls in her head.
oh, she had the sound of the waterfalls in her head. So it was called The Falls. But I thought that you may like it. You may like to see it only because even
Yes.
though the culture was very different, the distancing of the mother-daughter experience and the arrangements that happened, and so it was very nice to see. I thought you'd like it.
Thank you. Yes.
And I thought that you'd like to see this dopey series called Derek. Not exactly dopey, but it is kind of weird. But it's people who've fallen in love with each other in an old geezer's home. So that they're not exactly a literal business or anything like that, but they just have fallen in love with each other as friends. The weirdest scenes are there. So we were just goofing on it a little bit. And since it was called Derek, we figured that maybe you'll get a kick out of it.
I'll check it out.
I hope this hasn't been too dopey, Kai. So you don't see anyone else on then, Kai?
Jimmy, Carrie, and somebody whose name is Blue in Light.
Okay.
I have
And,
said hi.
and Kerry, how are you doing? You okay? Well, I'll speak to you maybe on Sunday or tomorrow night. How are you doing with this tomorrow night sort of situation? Shall we carry on with Thursdays, Derek, or what's your feeling?
I like it. I was thinking maybe it might be cool to do like a YouTube like Kai's doing. I don't know if you'd be up for that. It's a different kind of day for it, you know?
Yeah, let's see. I'm also saying bye-bye. You know what
Wait
I
a
mean?
minute. Wait 1 second.
Okay. So I'm kind of, although there are some friends who are, are you leaving, Urja?
Well, I told my daughter I would call her back because,
Okay.
yes.
Okay,
call
so
you
I'm just talking with Derek for a moment, so that's okay. We'll see you then, maybe tomorrow or Friday or Sunday.
Yes.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, let's look at that. What do you think?
I mean, I think it would be relatively easy to do. You know, I guess we'd have to check with people and see if they're up for it, though.
Look, if you go on my website, you see almost 50 years of a story there. And in fact, some of the pictures of me as a kid or something at 8 years old, and but basically, I just looked at some of the pictures there, and it showed different phases of the experience. And they were distinctly different phases of the experience, of the same experience. And it all came out of this hanging out phenomena of normalcy, where all of a sudden communities came out of just friendships. And inherently in that was an immersive experience, which didn't have a literal philosophy to it, but had elements of philosophy to it. Just the immersive of a shared experience. Then each person had their own reality in the circumstance. So as we saw with kidding around with Reed, that each person took a bit of the experience and made a life out of it. And each person did their thing. But each person expressed themselves somewhat through the experience that they had. Yet they were very different people in their makeup and in expression. But for a moment, they shared a happening. Then also in life, it found a reason to break up or to shift or whatever. So it looks like the reason did it. But you see, the breakup was inherent in the story. If you saw the movie of it, you would understand the breakup was inherent and it was looking for an incident. So it looks like the incident caused it, but the incident revealed it in a way. So let's say from the creative perspective, you see that dissolution of form is inherently written into the form. And then there's a reason for it. An incident takes place or this or that. But then you see that there's a moment when there's a hey baby conversation where you see that the incidents that are happening are because you're going into it from the survival mode completely. And it's missing its energy. Are you into it? And if you're not into it, I don't know that you have to be hypnotized into being into it, or you have to be convinced or legally threatened or something like that. Into it means that it exists because you shared something and you were into it. If you cease to be into it, it's starting to cease to exist in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you are forced to be into it, so it continues to exist, you start to see that the survival of it is at the consequence of the genuineness of it. That the survival mode then becomes normal to dominate the story, where then everyone suppresses. And then 5 years later or something, you say, what the hell did I do? How did I? Okay. You see, it was written into the element when it shifts to survival. Not to make survival bad or good or whatever, but it takes over when there's an actual happening like that. And you see then there's one then is into the story from the survival perspective. All the feelings go underground because they interfere in their literalness. And that means shut up. Just shut up, okay? We're trying to survive this thing. We don't have time for, okay. And so they say, well, hold it. I can understand if our boat was going down, we were really surviving.
Mm.
But to make our life survival is to limit our life to a small fragment of our existence. So then I still have the experience of the angel then coming into the body. And where it's an experience somehow from the angel, because it's not bringing a history into the story, it's bringing more of a mystery into the story. And when it brings the mystery into the story, it has a relationship to the mystery in the story. It sheds light on the mystery that's hidden in the story. It sees the amazingness of the only life that is lived, that it was normal. The life that it lived was normal. And they say, holy shit, you see the life that you've lived that became normal for you. And you understand why there was confusion and why there was this and why there was that. Of course there was. But in retrospect, you see a life being lived, and that confusion was a very important aspect of the experience. But you also existed in a world that somehow the larger world knew something that you didn't. When it saw you, when it looked at you, when it took your fingerprints, when it took your picture, when you took a test, somehow the larger world knew something about you that became you. And then somehow you found a way, in your own way, to release the story from its possessive in some way. And that was meeting this person, or that accident happened, or this or that. But then a creative dimension comes in your life, which becomes your expression. So even though you understand what they call real time out there, you're no longer a slave of real time. You're caring for something. Hope to see you soon. But you can explore that further if you wanted to, Derek. That, or should we wait until I pass away?
I don't think so.
No. How would you do it after you pass away?
Well, I mean, I could, or we have an archive, right?
Well, the doing wouldn't be so. And then you would become the other the information and the pictures and this and that. You would be out of the way. So that's somehow. But while you're alive, looking at the life that unfolded, without it being baloney or make believe, but that seeing all of it would be an experience, wouldn't it? To be able to see your life where you are exposed to the experience, just as if you saw a movie that touched you, where it made you cry or something like that. Not cry in a sense, but you saw a similarity, a human feeling was shared. And let's say you see the entirety of the life, not the literalness of the life, but the entirety of the life from that feeling. And even though you knew it, you experienced it. The experience to see it, you understand, must come from a place in yourself where it can't protect itself from the experience. So you see inherently in the life there's a beauty, there's a loss, but you also see there's no longer a fear of sadness, there's no longer a fear. You see how deeply a dimension, it's almost a chord that you play on the piano of sadness. It is a passage. And so you see that coming from the energy, you were in it for the whole human experience. And that you took on the persona necessary to have the experience. So then your life as a history and a mystery, I think that you have some dimensions of perception of it, of the energy that runs through it, that the life is no longer only the literalness of you, but also the creative thread that ran through the life, and how it's affected others in memory and other ways. There's Mary.
Hi, Mary.
And there's the rest of the house. We're going through a lot of changes here. Are we moving?
Oh, a little bit, yeah.
Segway is moving everything.
But I have a real workshop now.
And how have you been doing with these cryptocurrencies and NFTs and so on? Anything further?
Nothing real, no real developments. just paying attention to what's happening in the news and all of that. So I think it feels like the technology is moving really, really fast, but at the same time, there's kind of this waiting as you're waiting for developments. So
Have you gotten further involved, Kai?
Actually, we're getting more into the stock market. Tico's taking a weekly stock market class with,
Huh.
it's a guy's teaching it, but it's other teenagers he's in the class with every Friday. So
Oh, that should be okay. And that he understands how it works.
mhm.
Well, let's say, well, I think that he's still, no matter what happens, he's still going to have what you shared with him in the experience, but you're afraid to lose him to the literal world, you mean? No, he's picking up enough knowledge. Does he understand the cryptocurrency since he's immersed in it?
I think he understands it a bit. I don't think it's that much different from the stock market. And I know this guy does also teach crypto, so they might get into that at some point.
Yeah, well, the stock market is attempting, I think, to make a move on it now, isn't it? Or to
they've
organize.
been, yeah, they have been for sure. Like the beauty of Bitcoin is that it's an equalizer.
Yeah.
So
We see the beauty of it, but then we also see how it will be organized and possessed and owned. And there's already an eruption in the game, I think, because they're already selling T-shirts and commercials and so on. And so the players then came on and says, "Hey, man, we love the game itself and exploring it. We don't want another creep coming in where they're making a buck off. They're charging you for this and for that, like Netflix or something like that, where they nickel and dime you to death. We want to be free from that bullshit, man."
yeah, I mean the difference with the cryptocurrencies though, or the NFTs as it pertains to the games, or you actually they were selling you those things before, but you didn't own them. Now you own them uniquely, and nobody else can. So it's a kind of there's a kind of cooperative, I think, in that, in owning the collectibles relative to, say, a game.
Look, let's say years ago, if you traded a painting for a car, people did that, or they were traded food for work or something like that in the neighborhood, or the food that they grew. But let's say that trade-off has always been there. And that trade-off, in fact, I was reading the beginnings of wheat, that wheat was a different product. It was kind of a natural product in this period of time, but it was the only one that they could tax, because all the other grains they were hiding from the tax people and the government, what they were growing.
Mm.
But wheat was the one that they could tax because they could see it grow in the different seasons. And so that became the main thing, is wheat growing. And then it became more and more artificially wheat, that way you made it commercialized, and you made it into a product rather than a homegrown thing. So then that gave birth to this whole anti-wheat movement, and it wasn't anti-wheat as much as it was anti this chemical production that you've made.
Mhm.
That became bread, but no longer had any nutrients in it, no longer had any dynamic in it. There was nothing digested in it or anything. So let's say there was a resistance to the mechanicalness of existence. Because somehow it denatured it, but then you see that each generation bored up in that. Grilled cheese sandwiches with Velveeta cheese on white bread was normal.
Oh.
Or a hero sandwich with meatballs and gravy, holy, and a container of milk. And so then you see the normalcy of what is poison, and everyone was happy and satisfied. Eventually, if we ate it now, we would fall over. But somehow our body adapted and went with it and existed. It may have had a death sentence waiting for it. That stuff was terrible. And I say, why? Because it was the beginning of manufactured food, only having a hint of reality in it, but being manufactured almost completely, and yet being addictive. Its main purpose was to be addictive, so it was loaded with fats or salts or sweets or whatever, where it no longer had food value, but it did. Okay. So you see a system, and you then see a system that somehow you select what you eat and where you're coming from. And so then you start to see that it's not as karmic as it once was, but that it is more dharmic, that you then can create a way of living for yourself that doesn't need this and that, but basically is coming more from intuition or second nature, but not so obscure as that also doesn't refute science, these other elements into it. But basically, when one is caring for the life they're living, they're coming from a different place. The fear is not always the dominant factor. If one is more where you're coming from, you're caring for something. And you perceive naturally that you are navigating the human through the story. And that the human somehow lives in relationship. There's intuitive relationship, but then there are moments when there are actual moments of I and thou relationships where another and yourself become one. So you see relationships within, once one thing takes place, it opens up doorways of other aspects of it. And then you see the life having these dimensions to it, where relationships are in fact a dialogue going on all the time. And you see life is happening. You see the flux running through the story. You see the literal story and you see the shape-changing story happening as a constant. And then you'll also see elements, reflections. You'll see news changing every week, having similar elements, but a news supposedly. And it's a news that says we should be concerned about what these guys are saying or doing or what is happening. And we see our many relationships to life. But you see when it's organized in a literal sense and is a possessive to it, fear becomes the dominant element. And fear as a dominant element, not as a reflective element, which it would be for us, but as an active element of doing something about it, dumbs down the situation to some degree. Because then you see forces that are manipulating fear into a dynamic in the population. So then you see the so-called hidden 1% and the conspiracies, and you see that it's too dumb to conspire.
Collectively, you mean, like some grand conspiracy. Individually, it seems like it's just salt and pepper throughout.
When your relationship is to the creative, it is not so much dominated by extended life. Extended life is coming more from the creative dimension, not so much the literal dimension. You understand? So extended life, but through fear, is driven to continue. The life that is coming creatively is not driven in the same way. So the length of time that it exists for, because the creative process is going down. And I feel in that time, you can shift time, you can rearrange. When we're kidding around with joy, I'm not exactly kidding around. I'm saying in the living and dying process that is apparent between friends, and that we can create a condition where we can buy a year, buy 2 years, where the year is not the year. It's that there's a feeling hidden in this year. There's an experience hidden in this year that we can hang out for. And that's part of the creative experience. And I feel that when you perceive the life as a creative experience as being a deep dimension of your life, you see that the body is not separate from it as the body, a separate entity. And I feel that there's an agreement that happens, whether there's a literal agreement where you get every part to agree, but it's the kind of agreement that comes when you look out the window and it's snowing and you put on a coat and boots. There's an agreement to keep the feet warm, to keep the back and the body warm. So the agreement is happening. I'm talking about the consciousness of the agreement. Adds another dimension to the story around time and space. You see that there's some experience hidden, and that one is having a dialogue with the mystery in the everyday story. The consciousness of a conversation with the mystery may even happen in the loss of someone, or the passing of this or that, where you see that you've been living in a mystery all along while it's become a story and a history. But the experience of it is different than the knowledge of it. The experience of the mystery in your life sends you to a place that you've been trying to reach, but the reaching can't be false. So it kind of has to happen through an actuality that of the normalcy of the situation, in the magic of it. One is living in a creative space, in their everyday. And when one is living in a creative space, there's something holy in it. And it's not the trip holy. It is the holiness that comes out of perception, that you see that something is dear or something is touching. I feel to a large degree that's what's happening, but to a large degree it takes something in one before that can be perceived. I say that there are dimensions that are hidden in plain sight that are parallel to us in our life, where our lives are literally us as an identity, but at the same time, any friend, any lover, any relationship to you knows how many lives, they see how many dimensions of you in seeing you. And so to discover those dimensions is to come to some humanity in oneself, where you see the motive of the story is coming no longer from the survival mode, but the survival mode is an aspect of the story, not the dominant factor of it. You see that one experiences one's life creatively, so that the everyday that they took for normalcy is remarkable in its complexity and in the grid that we're in and that we share. Okay. Hope to see you soon. Take care. Namaste, everyone.
Thanks, Danny.
You okay, Colin?
Thank you, Danny. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye, everybody.